Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This evening in Washington, you're speaking to a group. They've asked you to come talk about the implications and consequences of the Clinton administration's foreign policy. How's Bill Clinton done the first year in foreign policy?
I think about as expected. I actually wrote an article last December about it. My view is that he was exactly the way he presented himself, a candidate of big business, a new Democrat, free from the old liberal cliches about entitlements and rights and so on, committed to improving the business climate, to engaging the government more in supporting the wealthy, the kind of thing he'd done in Arkansas. And I think that both the formulation of the policy, which came in late September, there was a series of speeches in which the Clinton vision, as they were calling it, was formulated, and then the achievements of the policy, which are essentially the November achievements, NAFTA, the APEC, the Asian Pacific Council Summit, associated domestic programs. That reflects his achievement in supporting the concerns and interests of major American corporations. It explains why the Wall Street Journal, for example, is so enthusiastic about him, describing him as continuing with what has been a pattern of Democratic presidents who link up very closely to interests of big business rather than small business, whereas the Republicans, in contrast, tend to be the party of the business community generally, so somewhat different. And I think that's pretty much what we're finding, and we will continue to find, I think, with the health plan and so on. On the other hand, in other foreign policy issues, such as, say, helping restore democracy in Haiti and so on, I mean, I never expected any possibility of that and don't see any.
If you mentioned some of those, the foreign policy achievements, let's go back and talk a little bit more detail. You mentioned NAFTA right off the bat.
Yeah.
Go into that a little further about the impact NAFTA is going to have.
Well, NAFTA, there's a good deal of the issue that was discussed, like will there be more jobs or less jobs? Nobody has any idea. I mean, the economic models that are being used are so remote from reality that what they say is almost meaningless, and that's pointed out a long time ago. The Congressional Office of Technology Assessment did an analysis of this executive version of NAFTA about a year ago and made that point, among others. However, there are some consequences about which there's pretty general agreement, and if you read the text and you see the international forces at work, you can understand why. It is going to have the effect of deepening the split between the wealthy and the general population. Now, inequality has been growing in the country for about 30 years. Real wages have been declining. Growth has been quite slow. Such wealth has been created is going increasingly to a small sector of the wealthy. The country's kind of taking on a sort of a third world look. I mean, it's not Brazil or Mexico, but if you walk through the streets of any major city, say Washington or New York or whatever, you see what the statistics tell you, that there's a large, relatively marginalized population developing, superfluous for wealth production, because increasingly transnational corporations are able to shift production to high repression, low wage areas elsewhere, and the wages will go down. In fact, they're going down internationally because these things all interact. So as U.S. wages are now the lowest in the industrial world outside of Britain. That's a big change over the last 10 years, in fact, a complete reversal. And that means that, say, German factories will invest in Alabama, as they're now doing, because they can get much cheaper and more repressed labor, so it brings down German wages. So what is anticipated from NAFTA, I think almost across the board, is a lowering of the income of a substantial part of the population, probably a majority, an increase in wealth for privileged sectors, and what that'll mean overall in the statistics is not so certain. So let me give you one analysis which is highly regarded and taken, actually appeared in the Washington Post, is by a UCLA professor of management, Edward Leamer, who's pro-NAFTA, I believe, and he estimated that by the end of the decade, if NAFTA goes through in the present form, the form that it did go through, there would be an increase his estimate was, of about $3,000 a year in income for professionals and people associated with the higher levels of the business community, managerial, skilled labor executives and so on, about $3,000 a year increase in income for them, about a $750 a year decline in income for most of the workforce, and he figured that would average out to about a $200 a year decline for the general population. And I believe he's pro-NAFTA, and most of the economists who are pro-NAFTA say something similar. So my colleague Paul Krugman of MIT, who's an international trade specialist, who's very pro-NAFTA, does agree that for unskilled labor there will be a decline in income. Unskilled labor happens to be 70% of the workforce. There was an analysis in the New York Times the day after the NAFTA vote. They delayed it. It's their first analysis of the regional impact of NAFTA, predicted regional impact in the New York area. And it was exactly the same. They said banking, corporate law firms, pharmaceutical corporations, the publishing industry, chemical industry, which is highly capital intensive, not many workers, corporate law firms, they'll all do fine. Then they said there'll be some losers. The losers will be women, blacks, Hispanics, semi-skilled labor. That's about 3/4 of the workforce. And the effect will be to increase, intensify the move that is very clear towards separating the society into two tiers. In the long term, it means sort of internationalizing the third world model. That's the typical third world country. Say Mexico, you know, small sector of very wealthy people, usually connected to international investment and finance and transnationals and so on, and a very large sector of extremely poor people. And incidentally, NAFTA is expected to have the same effect in Mexico. So the leading Mexican financial journal, which is very pro-NAFTA, estimated that about 25% of Mexican manufacturing industry would be destroyed in the first 2 years, and about 14% of the workforce would be eliminated. Another effect of NAFTA, which everyone expects, is that cheap U.S. agribusiness exports will contribute to a process already going on of driving out large numbers of peasant producers. All of this swells the workforce. Swelling the workforce drives down income. There is no serious opportunity for organizing. It's pretty repressive and brutal. So that'll have the effect of lowering wages there, just as it'll have the effect of lowering wages here. And this, if you look at the international system, this is a continuing drag. You know, any country that's providing more, where workers have achieved more rights, say rights to hold job security or pension rights or whatever, it's naturally going to be driven down as international capital can seek the point of highest repression and lowest wages. So you move towards an international economy of essentially low growth, low wages, and very high profits. And that's a kind of internationalization of the third world model, and this particular version of NAFTA is very likely to have that consequence. Now, you know, it should not be called a free trade agreement, because it is not. It is a highly protectionist agreement with a complex mixture of liberalization and protection designed to guarantee investor rights. Investor rights are very delicately protected. Worker rights, community rights, and so on are undercut. In fact, one consequence of it is to attack democratic institutions. The same is true of GATT. It places decision-making power in the hands of unaccountable structures which are transnational. If there's a conflict, let's say, between some local or regional decision on, say, environmental protection or pesticides or whatever, and in a transnational corporation, that'll ultimately find its way to an adjudication panel which operates in secret, which is made up mainly of corporate lawyers and so on, and is out of public control. All of these systems reduce the role and effectiveness of parliamentary institutions and unions and other popular groups, and increase the decision-making power of investors and transnational corporations and big banks and so on, and that's what they're intended to do.
Good afternoon, and welcome to a special live viewer call-in program on this Friday afternoon. Our guest for about the next 35 minutes now. Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You see the numbers at the bottom of the screen, and we ask if you've called in the past 30 days to wait so that others can get in with their calls a little bit more easily. First call is from Royal Oak, Michigan. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yeah, you know, you started talking about NAFTA, and you got me thinking about my first objection to it was just the fact that it was like 2,000 pages, and it's like you don't really understand it, and you think they're trying to fool you with something. And I was wondering, how long did bills used to be, like 100 years ago? And do you think that it would be possible for them ever to just say all future bills should be less than 10 times the length of the U.S. Constitution?
Well, you're quite right about not only the length of this, but if you do have a look at it, you'll find out it's also unreadable. I mean, it's very hard going. And recall that it was intended that this would be rammed through in secret. If you look at what happened, the agreement was signed by the three executives of Canada, United States, and Mexico in mid-August 1992. I think it was August 12th or so, 1992. Remember, that was right in the middle of a presidential campaign. Whatever one thinks of attitude towards NAFTA, it's obvious has a big effect on American life. Try to look back and find out what anybody said about it. It was very little discussed. In fact, probably wouldn't have been mentioned at all if Perot hadn't brought it up. Nobody knew about it. Nobody knew what was going on. According to U.S. trade law, there's a 1974 congressional legislation which requires that any trade-related instrument, any law or whatever involving trade must be submitted to the Labor Advisory Committee, a group based in unions, for advice and consultation and analysis. That's the one popular input to trade legislation. It was not given to them. They were, in fact, informed that their reaction to NAFTA was due on, let's say September 15th or whatever the date was, some date around then, and they were actually given the text of this 2,000-page document, unreadable document, 24 hours before the due date. That was to ensure that they couldn't even formally convene. All of this, incidentally, was suppressed in the press. Nobody talked about it. The Labor Advisory Committee did write a very detailed and rather interesting analysis, and they were very bitter about this and pointed out that even the procedure was a major attack on democracy. The intention was that all this would go through. Congress was on a fast track. They weren't going to pay any attention to it, and nobody would know. There was enough popular opposition that developed for all sorts of reasons so that it had to become a public issue, but it was not intended to be. It was intended to be, you can see by just what I described, it was intended to be driven home in secret and then just sort of sitting there, locking into place particular arrangements and particular achievements of the powerful. And as I mentioned, it itself is quite anti-democratic in its essential nature. So your reaction to the length of the text and furthermore the complexity of the text is quite accurate. And when we fill out more details, we see that that's a large part of it. In fact, I think it should. The major impact of these developments, including GATT, may well be to undermine democratic structures and to transfer power to private power, essentially, private transnational institutions. And recall that a corporation is essentially free from public control, and when it becomes transnational, even the limited control that comes from national legislation declines.
You are a professor of linguistics. What is linguistics, and what's the two parts, and what's the significance of its study?
Well, it covers a lot of territory, but the kind of linguistics that we do is an effort to find out the basic principles of a certain part of human cognitive nature. What is it that enables us to do what you and I are doing? What special thing is it about our brains, as distinct from other organisms, that enables these extremely complex systems of creation and articulation of thought and interaction, first of all, to develop? Why do they have the forms they do? What are the principles they operate under? What aspects of them are universal, just rooted in our genes, basically, which turns out to be most of them? And what does this tell us about the nature of the human mind? I mean, that's essentially the topic.
Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Good afternoon.
Hello. Gosh, I wish we'd stop dissecting every part of the United States and the world, why don't we go to a 25-hour-a-week work, and we could all go out and smell the roses? What's so bad about that?
Well, actually, proposals of that kind were made by, not for 25 hours, but I think 36 hours or something by the unions years ago. And it's a very interesting question. Remember, the fight for a 40-hour week was a huge battle. It took about 70 or 80 years of very bitter strife, and in the United States, very violent strife, I should say. I think about 700 workers were killed by security forces during that period, simply to attain the 40-hour week. And shortly after that victory was attained, it started being lost. So the 40-hour week is now a thing of the past. The average work week has been increasing through a variety of mechanisms since that victory was won. The question of whether there should be a lower work week should be, in my opinion at least, I mean, here values come in, but in my opinion it should be basically a matter of democratic decision. But of course, for it to be a matter of democratic decision, that means that corporate power has to be under democratic control. If the decisions are made by private power, unaccountable private power, they're naturally going to try to drive their workforce down to the lowest possible level and get the maximum out of them. And if that comes from having 60-hour weeks, they'll drive for that.
Garden Grove, California. Good afternoon.
Yes, I wanted to ask Mr. Chomsky if he believes that if there are no changes made in the way we trade and operate internationally, whether this wouldn't, in the long run, reduce the world to global serfdom. And then it seems we're right back to where communism came in the first place. If people cannot survive, they're going to rebel. And here we spent 40 or 50 years fighting communism, and we seem to be moving into the direction where we're going to get it back.
Thanks for the call.
Well, there's a lot to say about what we call fighting communism. For one thing, there's no plausible sense of the word in which the Soviet Union was communist or socialist or anything like that. It was a totalitarian state which was, from its origins, radically opposed to any element of the traditional socialist vision. But whatever it was, this was a big part of the traditional third world, which is essentially what Russia and East Europe were, was Europe's third world, had been for hundreds of years, which went off on a course of independent development, which we call communism and they called communism. We don't allow parts of the third world to escape from their service role. It doesn't matter whether they're little ones or big ones. And that led to a big conflict. They are now back in the third world. That's what losing the Cold War means. And I don't think it's the revolutionary changes that took place in Russia were indeed a reaction to their deeply impoverished third world conditions. They had nothing to do with socialism or anything like that, but that's what they were, you're right. Our effort to destroy it was not an attempt to improve economic conditions. In fact, take a look at the parts of the third world that we do control. Take, say, Brazil, huge, rich country with enormous resources, which we've had a big, strong hand in running since 1945, and take a look at it. That's what we've been trying to create in the third world. It's a country with a sector, 5 or 10% of the population, of great wealth. The average level of the country is about at the level of Albania or Paraguay. There's maybe 75% of the population lives in utter misery. And this is in a country with enormous advantages, no enemies, tremendous resources, a lot of U.S. aid, and in fact U.S. tutelage since 1945. And my suspicion is that's what much of Eastern Europe will come to look like. But you're right about the tendencies that now exist are polarizing tendencies. Much of the world, indeed most of the world, the society is becoming polarized on an international scale with there's low growth in most places. There's increasing wealth, but in very small sectors, and substantial parts of the population are declining. They have to be controlled by force. In my opinion, it's kind of symbolic that the anti-crime bill passed a couple of days after NAFTA passed. I mean, NAFTA is going to have, I think it's fairly clear, this polarizing effect, meaning more people, more social disintegration, meaning more crime, meaning more force. because unless something constructive is done to reconstruct society, you're just going to control people by force. And will it ultimately lead to rebellion? Sure, I think it probably will. I mean, South Central Los Angeles is a case. I wouldn't call it a rebellion. It's a breakout of some kind, but it's a response. I mean, these are, take, say, South Central Los Angeles. I mean, these are regions where there were jobs at one point. There was industry. When that disappears, you get social disintegration, which can take all kinds of forms. I mean, abuse in families, for example, alcoholism, random violence. I mean, it can take a lot of forms. It could possibly take constructive forms, and I very much hope it will. And those constructive forms ought to be efforts to reverse these tendencies, which are deeply rooted in the international economy.
LaGrange, Indiana. Good afternoon.
Yes, Dr. Chomsky. I'm a student at Purdue University, and I would just like you to know that you've been an inspiration to me academically. My question is, how would you like to see President Clinton respond to the growing nuclear threat of North Korea?
I would like to see serious efforts against proliferation. And looking at North Korea alone does not really respond to that issue. First of all, the question of North Korea is in a broader context. But bear in mind that while Clinton is talking about the threat of nuclear proliferation in North Korea, he's also contributing to nuclear proliferation. So one of his grand achievements at the Asia-Pacific Summit was to override congressional restrictions on sale of high-technology equipment to China. Now, those restrictions were imposed by Congress when Congress was given what they considered conclusive evidence that China was involved in missile proliferation, possibly involving North Korea, incidentally, and possibly also nuclear proliferation. And if you look at Clinton's summit decision, it was to give them supercomputers, which, as Pentagon analysts quickly pointed out, can be used for missile development and nuclear development, and also to allow U.S. exports for nuclear power generation. Now, nuclear power generation and nuclear weapons production are very close, and since China has, if we can believe U.S. intelligence, been engaged in proliferation, essentially Clinton was saying that I don't care about proliferation. What I care about is profit for U.S. corporations. There are other cases, too. I mean, one of the major nuclear powers, aside from the really big ones, is the State of Israel, which, as the CIA pointed out decades ago, has hundreds of nuclear weapons. Well, you know, its nuclear capacity is an element in the world which has a lot of people frightened. I don't see any concern about that. When you turn to North Korea, I think the problem is real, and I think it's a problem of how North Korea is to be integrated into a world system under conditions in which it is at the moment pretty desperate and pretty unstable. And that issue goes beyond nuclear weapons. It looks to me as though North Korea is kind of desperately trying to trade some form of potential or maybe actual nuclear weapons development against a form of acceptance into the international system. And I think that's the direction that should be pursued.
The last call was a student. What kind of a teaching load do you still carry?
Regular teaching load. At a place like, I teach graduate school, so it means, well, I don't know, maybe several hours a week of actual lecturing and many hours a week of person-to-person interaction with students, plus.
And you've been teaching for how many years?
Let's see, 38 years, I guess. All at the same place.
After nearly 40 years, what do you still like about the classroom?
Oh, it's really exciting. I mean, there's nothing more exciting than the intellectual interchange and the interaction with students, whether it's in children. At one time in my life, I actually taught children, now teaching advanced graduate students. And it's always an exciting experience, or can be. Yeah.
McLean, Virginia. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dr. Chomsky. Two questions. Number one, have you written another book since Deterring Democracy, or do you have another one in the works?
Yeah, several.
Oh, great, great.
3 or 4, in fact.
I'm a little bit on the, they're kind of hard to find, you know, in
Yeah.
terms of the system that I'm in.
Let me see if I can remember them. I'll list them for you really fast. Year 501, Rethinking Camelot, Chronicles of Dissent, Letters from Lexington, and Prosperous Few and the Restless Many are what come to mind.
Great, Great.
Caller, you said they're hard to find?
Well, they're usually not on the shelf per se, or you have to special order them in terms of being able to get them. I don't like to wait around for things to come in. I just like to see what's on the shelf, and they're a little bit on the scarce side. So
yeah, they are. They're also not reviewed, so it's hard to know about them, and they're usually published by small presses, which don't have the resources to advertise.
Okay, one other quick second question. In terms of looking at the mass media these days, you don't really see much contrary opinion, real contrary opinion, when you're looking at the major media. And it's good to see that at least you get out every once in a while. I caught you on Posner and Donahue a while ago. And what do you think in terms of getting more dissent, in terms of real contrary opinion into the media? Do you think that'll be happening, or how does that work?
I wouldn't think it's not, on its own it won't happen. I mean, the media are basically huge corporations which sell audiences to advertisers, and they're going to reflect the interest of their owners and their buyers by and large. However, as popular pressures develop, as popular organization takes place, and popular involvement in the political system and in social change and so on, the media will respond to it. I think you're quite right that there's more openings now than there were, say, 30 years ago. At least I experienced that to a limited extent. And I think it's just a result of the changes that have taken place in the country. I mean, it's a more active, lively, vibrant society than it was 30 years ago, and this is reflected in the media to some extent.
Why are your books hard to find?
They say unpopular things. So one book of mine happens to be on the U.S. media. It was a bestseller in Canada. It was literally a bestseller. It was based on lectures given over Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I don't think it had a single review in the United States. Why should American media want to publicize a critical analysis of the American media?
San Francisco, good afternoon.
Yes, hi, Professor Chomsky. I want to let you know that I was at the premiere of your the documentary about you when it premiered here in San Francisco, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. My question for you is, now that the historians are starting to speak about the 80s and the Ronald Reagan presidency, I'm not so interested in, what you feel about Ronald Reagan. More, what do you feel the continued effects as we head into the next century are going to be of, and maybe speak to the conditions that brought this about?
Well, the Reagan, I think you're right in putting Reagan aside. I think he was mostly a symbolic figure. Probably didn't even know what policy was most of the time. But the policies that developed in the Reagan years were, in fact, continuations of the late Carter years. So if you look at the last few years of the Carter administration, Carter called for vast expansion of the military budget and cutback of social programs. Though he didn't have quite the political clout to push that through, but the Reaganites pushed it through. And in fact, the military programs of the Reagan years are not all that different from the projections of the Carter years, same with the cutback of social programs. And this goes back to things that happened in the early 70s, when there were big changes that took place in the international system. One of them was that Richard Nixon dismantled the Bretton Woods system, the system that developed after the Second World War of international sort of capital regulation, in which the U.S. was in effect the world banker. That was one of a number of factors that set in motion a substantial, in fact huge, growth of speculative capital in the world, accelerated the internationalization of production, meaning shifting of production abroad and that sort of thing, and set a lot of other forces in motion. This meant a sharp attack. It meant lower growth, sharp attack on welfare and living standards and wages. Real wages in the United States have been declining since about that time, in fact. And the Reagan years simply extended and accelerated these differences. So the Reagan years were years of substantial polarization. Maybe 70% of the population, its actual absolute wealth declined in the Reagan years, whereas for the top few percent, they became greatly enriched. And this just is a continuation and indeed acceleration of the kind of processes we've been talking about. And unless they're also going on in the Clinton years. And unless the population does something about them, they're going to continue.
Syracuse. Good afternoon.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say I've long admired your work, studied it here at Syracuse University.
Oh.
I was wondering how you feel NAFTA will affect third world countries, particularly countries in Central America. You spoke earlier on third world economies.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the Central American countries technically aren't in NAFTA, but and it's a little hard to predict. There was what was called a Caribbean Basin Initiative, which was going to include the Central American countries and the Caribbean countries, and that was the policies of the Caribbean Basin Initiative were what are called liberalization. I mean, those countries are to open themselves up to market forces. Now, that has a general, and NAFTA will probably in the long term contribute to opening up third world countries to market forces. Now, there are a lot of, rich countries don't allow themselves to be open to market forces. So the United States is highly protectionist. It has all sorts of systems for massive state intervention in the economy, and it always has. Every successful developed country relied, from England up till South Korea and Taiwan, relied on, including us, relied on radical intervention, state intervention to protect economic power from market forces, and it continues until this day. The Pentagon system, for example, economically speaking, is just a funnel by which the general public subsidizes high-tech industry, which is, of course, a radical violation of market principles. However, the third world is to be deprived of those mechanisms so that it will, in fact, be a kind of service area. And the effect of these programs, there have now been so-called structural adjustment programs. There have been over 75 of them. I've forgotten how many exactly. The general effect that they have is to lower labor's share of national income. That's the overriding effect. I mean, then what happens, depends on one place to another. But they themselves have this polarizing effect, and that's the way market forces work. We have here a mixture of market forces and state intervention, and the state intervention is for the benefit of the wealthy. In fact, if you want to know how it works, have a look at Clinton's great triumph in Seattle. The sort of centerpiece, which got so much hoopla, was a speech that he gave in which he announced his vision for the free market future in the Pacific. And he picked a model company, which he called a model for what other American corporations should do. And he, in fact, gave the speech in a building of that model company, a hangar of the Boeing Corporation. That was the model for the free market future. Boeing is a publicly subsidized corporation. Boeing relies extensively, even for its existence, on the Pentagon. If it wasn't for the Pentagon funnel, Boeing would not be the country's major exporter and practically wouldn't be functioning. And the same is true of the aeronautical industry altogether. The same is true of the other, we mentioned Cray supercomputers, being given to China. Why do Cray supercomputers exist? Because the public paid the costs of research and development for computers and, in fact, provided a substantial part of the market through the whole Pentagon system, the Pentagon, NASA, and so on. These are the kinds of interventions in market processes that benefit a certain sector of the economy, the more skilled professional investors, top managers, and so on. As far as Central America is concerned, no, they're going to be subjected to market forces. In fact, we've done this. Costa Rica in Central America was the one exception to the Central American model of almost total social disaster. Remember, this is the region of the world where we have had the most influence. We take a look at Central America, we learn a lot about ourselves. That's where we've had enormous influence because of proximity for a long, long time. There was one exception to the disaster, the horror chamber that's most of the region, namely Costa Rica, which, for various reasons, had developed a kind of Western European sort of social democratic character and was a much richer country than the rest. Well, during the Reagan years, there was a pretty harsh attack on that. Costa Rica, there was a lot of pressure on Costa Rica to abandon its social programs, to cut back on domestic investment, to open itself up to market forces, in fact, to become very much like the other countries of the region, and it largely succeeded. The United States is a pretty powerful country, especially relative to Central American countries. So the fate for Central America, NAFTA or no NAFTA, in my opinion, is, unless we do something about it, because they're not powerful enough to do it themselves, is to become essentially export platforms for American industry which will use extremely cheap and repressed labor for profits here and elimination of jobs here.
Gainesville, Florida. Good afternoon.
Professor, thanks for your recent visit here to the University of Florida. I'm a student in philosophy down here. I appreciate your talk. I especially appreciated the comment about the Florida State University mascot. I thought that was appropriate. My question is this. Certainly we expect each individual to make up their own mind about issues and not make up their mind based on their political affiliation. But what was unique to NAFTA that allowed for individuals like, say, yourself and Pat Buchanan, or, say, Bob Dole and Bill Clinton, normally on other sides of the political aisle, to hop into bed together, so to speak?
Well, NAFTA was an interesting issue. I mean, it was a very, overwhelmingly, it was a class issue. In fact, the New York Times even permitted itself the unusual phrase class lines, which was rarely, a term which rarely appears in the media because it's a little too revealing. But they did point out that the attitude toward NAFTA by and large broke down on class lines. Corporate power was overwhelmingly for it. Business and corporate power was overwhelmingly for it. The workforce was overwhelmingly against it. The media were overwhelmingly for it, but they almost automatically respond to corporate interests. Despite the enormous media barrage, virtually 100% approval, the general population remained somewhat against it. So the latest polls I saw, I think in September or maybe October, showed about, of the portion of the population that had an opinion, it was about 55 or 60% opposed, which is something that had stayed pretty steady. As for Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot, they were a little bit exceptional. Usually they take a corporate stand, and on this issue they didn't for whatever reason. I think you'd have to look into their particular point of view and motivations. But you're right, that's a funny alliance.
Los Angeles, good afternoon.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I just took a class from you this semester at Chapman University. I had a question. I was wondering, where do you think, how and who do you think should regulate the content of the media? Janet Reno was just in Congress speaking about how TV violence should be stopped. Do you think that the companies, the media itself, could control themselves, or do you think there should be a regulating force, governmental force behind it?
Well, I'm personally very skeptical about any form of regulation of any kind of speech. Now, the media don't even begin to approximate freedom of speech. I mean, this is the kind of freedom where people who own the place set the rules. So that's not real freedom. Nevertheless, the idea of, even in that kind of system, heavily skewed towards extreme wealth, personally, I'd be reluctant. I'm very reluctant to see any kind of regulation take place. Freedom of speech is a really important value. Over the centuries, particularly in the United States, won a lot of, won substantial freedom of speech, and I think we ought to preserve it. However, with regard to the media, I think there's a much more serious question. Should the media be democratized? I mean, if the media are institutions of private power, we can be quite sure that they're going to have a particular take on things. They're going to give a picture of the world which, by and large, reflects the interests of their owners and their advertisers and other centers of power in the society. And that means that the attitudes and points of view and interests of the general public are going to be marginalized. And I think the answer to that is not, regulation, it's democratization. The specific question of violence on the media is a hard one. I think you have to have a balance between, which is not easy to determine, between allowing full freedom of expression and imposing some restrictions on what people are exposed to. So, for example, even the most passionate advocate of freedom of speech does not believe that, say, I have a right to go into your living room and put up a pornographic poster or something. That's, you might say, my inability to do that's a restriction of freedom of speech, but I think everyone agrees with that. When you move to a, say, poster in Times Square saying, I don't know, some obscene thing or disgraceful thing, the issue becomes more complex because it's not really private space. It's just the space where you are. And the conflict between the right to private space and the right to freedom of speech begins to be ambiguous. When you go to the media, it becomes even more ambiguous. It's, in a sense, private space. I mean, that's, given the way the society is, you just kind of you're not compelled, but you're at least driven to being exposed to it. And therefore what's on it is a kind of involvement in your private space, but at a more remote step. It's at this point that values become difficult and decisions become difficult. However, my own bias, at least, would be against, I think the burden of proof has to be on anyone who wants to introduce any form of regulation, in my opinion.
Washington, D.C., good afternoon.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'm also a fan of yours. I've read at least 5 or 6 of your books and many of your articles over the years. I work, quote, within the system here in Washington, D.C. I have for about 10 years. And I was wondering your perspective on the election of Bill Clinton over George Bush and whether you think there's any positive difference whatever for either the American people or people internationally of his being elected.
There is some difference between what Bush represented and what Clinton represented. I mean, Clinton was essentially what's called a moderate Democrat, kind of a right-wing, a pro-business Democrat, a new Democrat. And that means it's very difficult to distinguish that from moderate Republican. But there were some differences. If you look at the campaign, for one thing, the Republicans and the Democrats have rather different constituencies. The Republicans are quite openly the party of business. They don't pretend to be much else. The result is that they don't really appeal to a popular constituency the way the Democrats do. They, by and large, have to appeal to a public constituency on the basis of jingoist appeals, fear, religious fundamentalism, and so on. You could tell it from the Republican convention. And that's a substantial part of the population. And the Democrats, on the other hand, put themselves forward as the party of, the working people and the ethnic minorities and women and so on. In fact, in practice, they're just more or less another business party. But the difference in constituencies shows. So when these parties are in power, although the major decisions that they make keep to the essential agenda of the state-corporate nexus, which doesn't change a lot, on other issues which are of less significance to major private power, they do different things. So on issues of, say, the Reagan administration and Bush as well carried out a very substantial attack on civil rights, and I would and that harms the interests of the popular constituency of the Democrats, in fact, the general public. And I would expect, and I think we already see, a slight difference in that respect. Things like, say, a limited amount of family leave, which just about every industrial country has, in fact, far more than we. Bush vetoed it, Clinton passed it. Again, that's sort of throwing crumbs to the constituency. These crumbs are not minor, incidentally, with regard to what our lives are like, but they're very minor with respect to the major interests of maximization of power and wealth. So if you read, say, the Wall Street Journal, the main business journal, you'll find they're very enthusiastic about business and about Clinton and describe him as one of the best candidates big business could imagine, despite the fact that on, say, social programs and other things, he may not be entirely to their taste. There was also a difference that you could detect on major economic policy. The Clinton administration called much more openly for state intervention to support and protect major economic centers than the Republicans did, though they're all protectionist. The Republicans tended to be a bit more ideological about it and not to intervene, not to call so openly for, or so extremely for intervention to protect business from market forces. Clinton called a bit more for that, and in fact has done a bit more. So Clinton's national export strategy, announced in late September, called for an extension of policies that the Reaganites and Bush had pursued, which were in violation of GATT, as everyone admitted. And Clinton wanted to extend that, and it was put rather well by the Secretary of Treasury, Lloyd Benson, who said something like, I'm tired of this level playing field business. I want the playing field tilted more toward the interest of U.S. business. So we always tilt the playing field in the interest of U.S. business, but they wanted to tilt it a bit more.
Buffalo, New York, good afternoon.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
I'm a graduate student, and I'm interested in educational history, and I think that, like the media, higher education has played a role in reinforcing corporate interests. And I'm wondering, do you believe that higher education in the future is going to become more democratic or less democratic?
Depends on what people like you do about it. If there is no popular involvement in this, private power will have its impact, which is significant, and that's going to make it less democratic. For universities and the whole educational system to be more democratic, there has to be some counterbalancing force to private power. And that only counterbalancing force can be public involvement in democratization. So to the extent that such forces exist, the universities can become more democratic. In fact, they have become more so in the last 30 years, in my opinion.
We have, with just a few seconds left, you've written so much already, and you mentioned earlier 3 or 4 books in progress. What do you hope comes from your writings?
Well, my hope is that it'll stimulate people to try to ask questions about the world and find their answers. I mean, I have what I think are my answers, but I think if people have a broader range of analysis and information available to them, they're in a position to come up with better insight and better understanding, or at least so I hope. And then, of course, I hope they'll do something about it, because just having the ideas in your mind doesn't change the world.
Noam Chomsky is professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you very much.
Glad to be with you.
And we thank you for your calls and your comments. Have a good afternoon.